Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery and I'm trying to see if I could use the natural sunlight that's streaming in through the window to try to get my worms to kind of dive down out of the bait that I've got set up over here. And I mean, yeah, the bin is kind of sitting up pretty steep in terms of the incline that it's resting at. That's why a whole bunch of this stuff is slipped down. Normally I'm in here in these African nightcrawler systems with the objective in mind of rinsing off the mites that are on the bait that I had put out here. And this piece of bait that I had put out for these mites has only been out here for 3 days. And in those 3 days, these poor worms that have had nothing to eat for almost 4 weeks now, they've been given nothing fresh to eat for that long now. They must be getting pretty desperate, because they've come up and they pretty much gobbled up the bait that was out here originally to try to lure the mites out of the system. And there's still certainly a good number of mites collecting over here on the paper. And I saw a few on the bait, but I would be I guess my guess would be that the mites couldn't get at the bait because the worms mobbed it. So I guess I'm gonna rest this back down so it's not on this steep angle, so the worms can you know, maybe dive down a little bit. I'm gonna take all this stuff over to the sink and rinse it, but first I'm gonna try to get some of these worms off, and then we'll do another reset here. But it certainly seems like we're nearing the end on this. It does seem to me like almost, I don't know, almost like the other system that we're trying to bait the worms out of has more mites in it, but showing a great deal less wear on the melon. Mainly because it's only mites that have been coming up for the bait in that other one. And the mites are working that melon down a little bit, but not nearly as quickly as the worms have been working this melon down. So yeah, I was just figuring I would use some of this bright natural sunlight here to see if I can get the worms to evacuate the bait station, but it didn't seem to do the trick so much. So I'll just evacuate the worms myself by kind of nudging them off the bait and off the paper. Then I'm going to take this stuff over to the sink and rinse it off. Alright, so I've brought everything up here on the bench and I've slipped on a glove so I can get a little bit more hands-on with what we're doing here. And I am going to take these objects over to the sink and give them a rinse so we could do a quick reset on our baiting station here. But we got to get rid of all these little worms first. We don't want to flush them down the sink, right? Let's do our best to knock off all these little worms. It's just interesting how the greatest number of worms on here are little tiny baby worms. I feel bad because, you know, I know that the main reason that they're coming up, I'm fairly certain, I can't say I know, but fairly certain that the main reason they're coming up for this piece of bait is mainly for the moisture that's in it, because the material down in the bin is very dry at this point. There was a couple days ago when I actually came in here with my squirt bottle and tried to sort of rehydrate the material some. So I squirted everything down quite thoroughly. I mean, I stirred it around, and I squirted it, and I stirred it more, and you know, I did my best to introduce a good amount of water into here. But you know, you saw the way it was kind of covered with paper only, so there really wasn't a great deal to prevent that moisture from simply evaporating out of the system. And even though the vermicompost has a pretty good ability to hold on to its moisture, I'm fairly sure that that little bit of moisture that I placed in here kind of you know, spread out and equalized throughout some of the more dry stuff that it was near, you know, resulting in possibly a slightly more damp material down within the bin, but still probably not quite damp enough to keep the worms comfortable. Otherwise, you know, the large of the population, if not the entire population, wouldn't be congregating around this little piece of melon. I mean, I don't know, maybe it has something to do with just the fact that there's been no fresh food added to this system for so long. But you know, worms will easily make use of all kinds of materials, and the materials in this bin are, you know, plentiful as far as edible foods, as long as there's enough moisture for the material to be consumed. So it just keeps taking me back to the premise that it's probably just becoming way too dry in this system for them. The bait station still seems to be drawing some mites together. There's mites on this paper, there's mites on the melon, and mites on the on these chunks of pineapple as well, but not too many. A lot of people have already been kind of proclaiming success in this bin, you know, patting me on the back in the comments, you know, virtual pat on the back sort of, saying, hey, you've done it, congratulations. And you know, if we use my old 80-20 rule, then you know, if 80% success is enough for a win, then yeah, I might have actually reached the goal here in terms of getting rid of the mites. It probably is realistic to say that I've probably eliminated a good 80% of the mites that were in this bin, just based on the fairly low numbers that are coming together anymore up here in this bait station. But it's not 100%, obviously, because every time I put the bait back out the next day, there's more mites on it. But certainly not in the vast numbers that we've seen in the past, or in the numbers that we're still seeing in the other bin either. That's always been pretty consistent with this system anyway. This system never did seem to have quite as many mites in it as the other system. So I think the task of getting rid of them from here was not quite as a challenging job as it is in the other bin. In the other bin, I think we've got quite a bit more. Because over there, I just checked over there, I just took a peek inside how things are progressing in there, and I could see a far greater number of mites hanging out on the paper there and on the bait. So let me go rinse these things off, and you know, in the meantime, I know these worms are going to want to kind of squirm out of view of these bright lights overhead. So let's just bring them back over to this nice damp material that we've got out here, instead of leaving them over on that really dry stuff on the edge. And I know that what's right beneath them is just a whole bunch more worms. So I just want to make sure they've all got some place to go where they can get out of these bright lights while I go wash things up. So instead of letting the camera roll, I'm going to try something a little different. I'm going to switch my camera to time-lapse mode, and we're going to actually shoot a time-lapse. I'm trying to think what the interval, I think it's every 5 seconds a snap will occur. And then we'll see, or maybe every 2 seconds, I don't remember. But we'll see how that goes. Hopefully we'll get some interesting footage of these worms diving down out of view. So now, in addition to allowing a little time for the worms to squirm down out of view of the bright lights in the time-lapse, I also thought I'd leave a little extra time just to be able to see if there's any mite activity in here, which I'll only be able to see after the time-lapse plays back quickly. So, I am curious to see if, you know, some of these white dots that I'm seeing out here, whether they're mites or if they're, you know, bits of my eggshell that I put in here is grit for the worms. It's hard to say. So, you know, I'm going to kind of follow through here with what a lot of people have been saying, which is, you know, we're done, you know. I believe that there definitely are still mites in here. I think it was evidence on the paper. We saw a little bit of mite activity collecting on the paper, a little bit on the bait that we had out there, even though it was definitely hard to tell with all the worms gathered up on top of the cantaloupe melon. But here's the idea that I had going forward. It's time, I believe, to start giving these poor little worms a break. You know, the other bin is not quite as drastic yet, so I don't think it's crazy to allow things in there to continue, because it does seem like we could probably benefit from continuing to gather mites over in that other system. In here, though, I'm calling the mite excavation or the mite extraction effort as a finished done deal at this point. So I've actually come down here with a variety of different foods to give them. I've got a whole bunch of lettuce that's gone really bad, even though this is really the choice selected bits of it that are not that bad. I've got a whole bunch of it that's even worse. A lot of it had just turned to liquid already. And, you know, this is not very moisture-rich food, but this is. Here we've got a whole bunch of grapes, similarly gone bad. Some of them even show some signs of mold growing on them already, and I put these things in the freezer, and they're thawed out at this point. They're not even frozen anymore. I'm going to go ahead and reintroduce a new feeding to this system, and at the end we're going to return to covering things up with plastic so as to, you know, lock in that moisture that the food brings with it. However, it's going to be kind of a hybrid because, you know, I've still got all this stuff here for the reconstruction of the mite baiting setup. So I figured underneath the plastic covering we'll still set up the baiting station, but at this point, hopefully at this point, the worms will be, you know, drawn to the moisture in those grapes and in that lettuce, which will be out here on the sides. And then hopefully the mites that are probably still mixed into this more damp material here will be the ones that get drawn to this bait. So that was kind of my idea. It's hard to, you know, it's hard to know what's really going to become of it. I even thought that maybe crushing some of the grapes so that their moisture is right there, you know, squishing out of the grapes is maybe going to even make it that much more of an enticing place for the worms to go check out what's happening over there. So that was my game plan here for this setup over here. And you might have noticed I collected a bunch of stuff off the top surface, a bunch of stuff that looks like little bits of leaves and, you know, unbroken down bedding type materials. I figured I would position all of that right beneath the feeding area to let that stuff also benefit from some of the moisture, to let that stuff get hydrated and give that stuff a chance at maybe getting broken down a little as well. And it's not a very deep system, so I can't really submerge things too deep under here. But hopefully I've scattered enough stuff off to the sides with which to cover up over here. So I'm going to I'm just going to lay down a couple of these spring mix leaves. I don't know if it's lettuce. I think a spring mix is usually a mix of a variety of other types of leafy greens. And then I'm going to, I'm not sure how to go about this. Like I said, it'll be nice to maybe try to squeeze a bunch of these so that they're, you know, kind of breached, so that access to the juicy, damp inside is easily gained by the worms, and that they could sense the moisture right there. And I know that mites are probably also going to sense that as a bonus little place to go over to because of the sweetness and the dampness. And, you know, at this point, it just seems like the well-being of the worms is probably more important at this point. If we've not managed to get rid of all of the mites quite yet, and if it triggers a little bit of another outbreak of the mites, it's worth it at this point, I think, just to give these poor worms in here a little bit of a break, give them some moisture, allow the contents of the bin to dampen again a little bit. And then if need be, we can always go back to trying to bait the worms again at some point in the future, but I think that this little break for the worms is going to do them a lot of good in terms of a little food supply, a little moisture. I think it's quite overdue for these poor worms in this system. The other system seems like it could probably go a little longer. I almost forgot all this salvaged dry. Drop that down in there too. So leave a little bit of this to cover up with. We'll try to squeeze the rest of these babies into here. I probably could have gone with another handful over on the other side. And I got a whole bunch of these nasty grapes. So I think my other bins will be eventually getting some of this too soon. But here it seemed like a really opportune sort of a food to include as the first feeding for this bin in, you know, almost a month now. 27 days, I believe, since the last feeding was applied to this system. And let's get this thing covered up. Yeah, I mean, the stuff out here is so dry at this point. It's pretty much unusable by the worms. The worms probably can't even go into that stuff. It's so dry over there. And I guess we know where all the worms are. They're right down here in the middle. But if I want to set up my bait station the way I did yesterday, which is to make sure that the plastic covering sits flush on the surface of the material, you know, here it probably doesn't matter so much anymore because I am going to be covering up the whole shebang with plastic now. So airflow underneath the plastic cover that's covering the baiting station probably doesn't matter so much anymore. So the whole concept of submerging the baiting station down low seems a little bit irrelevant, so I'm not going to bother. But I guess we could give it a little bit of a push just so it is somewhat below the surface, if possible, before we cover up. In here too, even though there's going to be plastic over the whole thing, you know, maybe this will just help to create a little bit of a sort of specialized zone where only the mites will go. Maybe the paper will prevent some of the worms from making their way into there, and the mites will be able to get there or something. I don't know. It's all experimental. I don't know what to expect. But at this point, we're also returning to the plastic coverings, which help prevent any moisture from the bin to further escape. I'm going to do my best to make sure it's a nice thorough covering all the way out to the very edge everywhere, leaving very little ventilation space if possible. And I think the worms are really going to appreciate what's going on here because things have really gotten very uncomfortable for these little guys over the past few weeks. And, you know, hopefully we've actually succeeded in reducing the mites to a normal number, and hopefully it won't become an outbreak again. Alright, so now in the other bin it's going to be a little more simple. I think it's just going to be a matter of rinsing mites and restoring the baiting the way it was. So let's get that one out here. Alright, so now with this one, you know, maybe it would be interesting just to do another little time lapse here. Just uncover it so we can get a better look at the mites. And since they're such slow-moving little critters, it does seem like shooting a little bit of time lapse of them is the easiest way to see them as they move around slowly. So why don't I even bring the camera in just a hair closer. And we can switch over to time-lapse mode. Let these little guys squirm around for a while so we can get a better look at them. So I think we could see that there's quite a number of them. Luckily the lights overhead aren't going to cause them to go running back down into the bedding. They more or less stay right there on the bait. So we can, have little viewing parties of the mites without worrying about them all running away before we can decimate them. Alright, now here we've got to evict worms before we can rinse. It looks like the worms have chewed their way through quite substantially through this paper, trying to get up at the bait or moisture or whatever it is that they're trying to get at. You can definitely see a good number of mites hanging out on this piece of paper. The baiting here will definitely continue unchanged. Well, the only change I can maybe think of is maybe using a fresh piece of paper. This piece of paper has seen better days. Not that it makes a whole lot of difference. It might even be beneficial, since it does allow the mites to come up through that hole too, instead of needing to circumnavigate the edge of the paper to get up on top of it. So yeah, I guess there's no harm in just sticking with it. Just seems to be that one worm hanging out over there. I want to get back into the bin. Was I successful? Go. Oh, there's one more on the bait. Okay. Come on. All right, over to the sink, and then we can reset, and another day is done in the saga of baiting worms out of my systems. All right, I think I'm gonna raise the camera up a little bit here just so we can better see what we're working on. Bird's eye view, so to speak. And what I've got over here is the stuff that we just rinsed off. The base for the bait. This fairly tattered piece of coffee filter material with a big hole. A gaping hole at this point, much larger hole than we had before. I guess just the activity of rinsing it at the sink took even a greater beating at this point. Nice and damp. Should be a mite magnet. Luckily the bedding in here is still comfortable enough that the worms don't feel compelled to come up here just to get a little relief from the excess dryness. And you know, here, since we're not covering the entire shebang up with plastic, we are depending on our little plastic covering to maintain the moisture level beneath itself. So once again, I just want to make sure that it rests neatly on the surface and that it's not propped up by any of the stuff that it's attempting to cover. I think that way we ensure that what's beneath it is going to become a nice damp place where the mites are going to be drawn to. And we'll continue, you know. I guess we'll see how long it takes. I'm wondering, you know, if we were able to accomplish the mission at hand in the other bin in 10 days. Curious to see how long it takes here. Was it 10 days or 9 days? Maybe 9 days. 10 days? I've lost track. All right, everyone. That's it for today. I got a couple things to clean up and put away, but I'm not going to take your time with that because that's boring. Before I go, let me just really quickly say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please remember to leave me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone. Have a great day. Bye now.